In the early 1970s, a new committee appeared on the edges of the conflict in Northern Ireland, the Irish Northern Aid Committee, better known as Noraid. Over the next 2 decades, it would channel millions of dollars from Irish-American communities in the United States of America to Republican families, prisoners, and political campaigns in Northern Ireland. But how much of this money funded the Provisional IRA's armed campaign in Northern Ireland? To some, they were heroes, supporting the war back home, but others saw them as misguided Irish Americans collecting money to promote the cause of the Provisional IRA. This is the story of Noraid. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict in Northern Ireland. Before I get into this episode, I want to mention that one of the main sources for this episode is Robert Collins and his book Noraid and the Northern Ireland Troubles, 1970 to 1994. Robert Collins is a lecturer in the University of Limerick. I conducted this interview over 2 years ago, so I do apologise to Robert for taking so long to release this episode. I can be a little bit chaotic with how I organise the podcast. So let's get back into it. At the onset of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the IRA faced a split in 1968. The split was between the officials and the provisionals, and a line had been drawn in the sand and suddenly sides needed to be picked. Stay with the officials, who were more Marxist and politically focused, or support the Provisional IRA, who were more militant and committed to an armed struggle. The Irish-American diaspora in New York sided with the Provisionals, and it was out of this that Noraid was born. Let's hand things over to Robert to fill in some context.
Yeah, so I'll just give you a brief background. So the tradition of Irish emigration to America is something that's not a new phenomenon in the 1970s. It's been happening since the early part of the 18th century, but really en masse in the aftermath of An Gorta Mór, the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, 1850s, where you see a huge influx, somewhere between 1 and 2 million Irish-born people emigrate to the United States between the years of 1845 and 1855. So you have that huge influx of predominantly Irish Catholics to America, who are also somewhat, or certainly a section of them, are quite nationalist and separatist in their ideas. In other words, that this cohort, who are ultimately the ancestors of 20th century Irish Americans, who are arriving in the United States and have a very strong anti-British sentiment. For example, the late Shane Kenner wrote in one of his books about how the Dynamite campaign of the 1880s, which had been a bombing campaign conducted by the Republicans in England, had been almost entirely funded by Clan Gael in the United States, and he described them as almost more militant than their Irish counterparts. So you have that kind of tradition there, but also importantly, in the turn of the 20th century, you have prisoner welfare organisations being set up. So in the aftermath of the 1916 Easter Rising, during the War of Independence, you have prisoner aid funds that are set up in America, and their purpose is to fundraise in order to help fund the families, and also that money is going towards and helping to support the Republican movement, because regardless of where necessarily money goes, it's money in the bank, if that makes sense. So it's supporting it one way or another. And then you have, in the 1950s, during the border campaign or Operation Harvest, you have a much smaller version being set up in New York. And then you have the outbreak of kind of a unified national civil rights movement in the Northern Irish state in the mid-1960s, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And then they and sister organisations are set up in the United States to support the civil rights movement.
So let's take a quick recap. In the aftermath of 1916's Easter Rising, prisoner aid funds began setting up in America. Then, during the IRA border campaign of the 50s, Operation Harvest, it renewed fundraisers in New York. So naturally, when the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, or NICRA, sprang up in the 1960s, it gave birth to many sister organisations in the States, one of which would eventually become Noraid. So who was the individual behind Noraid? Michael Flannery was born in either 1902 or 1903 in North Tipperary. He joined with the Irish Volunteers and fought in the Irish War for Independence. He fought against the British, and then he joined the anti-treaty side of the Irish Civil War. This was the side that Eamon de Valera was on. He was subsequently captured, then interned, where he went on hunger strike before being released in 1924. He then emigrated to New York in 1927. In the same way many people left Ireland during the famine, many people who were on the anti-treaty side during our Civil War also emigrated. While in America, Flannery continued advocating for Republicans back in Ireland, and in 1969 he organised what would eventually become known as the Irish Northern Aid Committee, or Noraid. When choosing members, Flannery chose only those who have unimpeachable credentials, meaning only Irish-born, veterans of the War of Independence, and on the anti-treaty side. Here's Flannery explaining why he founded Noraid.
The reason why we're raising funds is to help the distressed people in the north of Ireland who have no other means of subsistence, most of them, and to help those who are in need, both clothes and food.
So what was Noraid fundraising for? Was it for buying guns for the Provisional IRA? I put this question to Robert.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, Oisin, because Noraid as an organisation themselves do very much want to stick to prisoner welfare. Now, that is not, and to fundraise for that cause, but that's not to say that individual members of Noraid are certainly very supportive and openly supportive of the answer. And when the money is sent back to Ireland, there isn't really a follow-up process as to, where, in terms of receipts or anything like that, into where the money is spent.
I've often talked about the Provisional IRA and the means in which they could fundraise. They had insurance scams, robberies, kidnappings, ransoms, car parks, wealthy dictator allies. There are a litany of ways they received money over the 30 years. I asked Robert how the money raised in America compared to various other means. He explained that America was indeed important to the Provisional IRA, but not necessarily because of the fundraising. In a fantastic recent documentary about Noraid broadcast on RTE, Bernadette Devlin McAlliskey said that the organisation was originally formed so as to give political context in America to the military campaign of the Provisional IRA. Basically, Noraid gave Irish republicanism American support, which in a way legitimised their cause. Though New York was the epicentre of Noraid, there were branches all over the US. And usually these branches sprung up in areas where there was a large Irish diaspora. In 1970, Michael Flannery himself travelled across America, setting up 62 chapters. It was claimed that in New York City and the Bronx, there were around 80,000 members, and this amounted to around 50% of the total funds raised by Noraid. There were also large chapters in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, as well as others in New Jersey, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Connecticut. In my years working as a guide in Ireland, I've met many Americans, and many of them recall being in a bar in the US and a bucket going around to help those back in Ireland. So how exactly did Noraid fundraise? And more importantly, how did they get the money back to Ireland? Though Noraid added this political context, they did indeed manage to successfully raise funds, and they were incredibly creative in doing so. The fundraising took the form of gala dinners, bake sales, prisoners' wives tours, direct mail appeals, merchandise sales, and of course, buckets in pubs. They were also quite creative in their campaigns to raise awareness as well. In one instance, the famous US magazine Playboy had a feature on the IRA, sandwiched in between photos of topless women. In another instance, an electronic billboard was rented in Times Square in New York, which offered messages of support to Irish Republicans in prisons back home. Again, there was often confusion in the US, as many didn't fully understand the conflict happening in Northern Ireland, and Noraid were very careful in how they approached advertisers. The electronic billboard was rented by Noraid member John McDonough, who said that it was for an Irish Catholic charity. The sign read, "Season's greetings to Irish prisoners of war," and then said the letters UTP. This stood for Up the Provos. But the person who rented McDonough the sign thought it stood for Up the Pope. This caused a bit of controversy and was reported in the media. For critics, this was a blatant pro-IRA sign, which was being plastered in the epicentre of New York. Most of the money raised by Noraid was in cash form, so it wasn't always easy to get that back to Ireland, especially if they didn't want to declare the full amount. One method that proved quite successful was to sew bundles of cash into women's bras and underwear, and then the women would take commercial flights to Ireland, handing the money off to the IRA's treasurer, Joe Cahill, or to someone in Dublin. Basic X-ray technology in the 70s couldn't detect the wads of money, so this was seen as a smart way to secretly bring the money home. Money raised by Noraid peaked during the 1981 hunger strikes. The hunger strikes made the Troubles in Northern Ireland front-page news all over the world, and are generally seen as a massive PR success through tragedy for Republicans. It also helped to define Sinn Féin's strategy going forward, as they realised the importance of the political world, with the Armalite and the ballot box. When strikers began to die, there were significant protests in New York, with 10,000 people protesting, carrying coffins with the strikers' names printed on the side. Noraid raised a record amount of money during these strikes. $250,000 was declared in the wake of the hunger strikes, but Robert believes that the actual figure was around triple that. And then in 1983, we saw the first of the Noraid-sponsored tours taking place in Northern Ireland. These were 7 to 10 day tours, where around 100 Irish Americans would be brought around Northern Ireland to experience the Troubles firsthand. The trips were organised by Sinn Féin, and visitors would stay in the homes of Catholic families. Bernadette Devlin McCalliskey mentioned in the RTE documentary that many families on the Falls Road complained about how much hot water the American tourists staying with them used. For these tourists, though, it was quite eye-opening. Most of these people were from middle-class America. And on these tours, they got the chance to see what living conditions were like in a working-class city full of British soldiers. In a way, these trips brought the Irish Americans out of romantic Ireland and into real Ireland. That being said, many of them found the trips quite exciting. In one instance, armed and balaclava-clad provisionals got on the bus to meet with the tourists and talk with them, thanking them for their support.
What I found really interesting about the tours was that it stayed with a nationalist family when they were there. So obviously they were getting the nationalist perspective. But what I found interesting was that the families which they stayed with, it almost had a bigger impact on them in terms of there were a couple of people who spoke at the launch who just happened to have had Noraid visitors stay with them in the 80s. And they said that just the idea that people in America actually cared about what's happening in West Belfast or in Derry was a big thing for them, even just as children, teenagers, and then obviously as adults. So as a nation, Ireland, we've looked to America to kind of give us legitimacy as a nation. I don't know.
The trips weren't exactly popular with the security services in Northern Ireland, who would sometimes get on the bus and confiscate the film from cameras of the tourists. Then there was one instance in 1984 where a contingent of New York police officers travelled to Ireland as part of the NYPD pipe band. They performed in the Rose of Tralee pageant before heading up to Bundoran in Donegal to take part in a parade commemorating the hunger strikers. Bundoran is quite close to the Northern Irish border. At the march, they were met with some hostility from Irish Gardaí, who made it clear to the NYPD officers that they resented what they were doing, marching in support of the Republicans. This was a sentiment that was often echoed in the Republic of Ireland, especially amongst media, politicians, and some of the general public. Many of them saw Noraid members as ill-informed, and their supporting of the IRA during the Troubles was doing more damage than good. Martin Galvin is another important name to include when talking about Noraid. He was their most visible face and strategist from the 70s into the 80s. He was a lawyer based in New York and helped to frame the conflict to American audiences. After the success of the 1983 Noraid tour in Northern Ireland, a larger one was organised for 1984, which would bring 130 Americans to Northern Ireland. A march was planned on one of the days, and British authorities banned Galvin from Northern Ireland, claiming that his speeches endorsed terrorism. He ignored the ban and was secretly brought across the border. The day of the rally saw a large police and army presence, who were determined to arrest Galvin if he appeared. The rally ended in Belfast, where a large crowd gathered, and Gerry Adams introduced Galvin, who hopped up to a podium and grabbed the microphone. But before he could give his speech, the RUC moved to arrest him, trying to push past the large crowd of supporters. Plastic bullets were fired, and there was pandemonium. In the wake of the chaos, Galvin disappeared and escaped being arrested. Many were injured, and one man, Sean Downs, died after being hit in the chest with a plastic bullet. Galvin returned to the Republic of Ireland, where he faced criticism from the media after this, who asked him if he felt responsible for Downs' death. He placed the blame on the British government.
The British left me with two alternatives: either to accept the ban and bow to British terrorism, or to break the ban by an act of civil disobedience. As I said, it would have been unconscionable to have submitted to this order. If this has done anything to shorten the time that British terrorists are on Irish streets, then I am happy for that. I'm happy that that the people of Ireland and the people of the British mainland would be closer to peace. I, of course, deeply regret the death of Sean Downs, the injuries to all those other people. As I said, no civilized person could have foreseen that the British government would clearly act in the terrorist fashion that they did 9 days ago.
The Irish government also said that Galvin wasn't welcome in their country, and that Americans coming over and trying to help was an embarrassment. Galvin responded, claiming that the Irish government had abandoned the people in the north. He returned to Northern Ireland again in 1985 and attended the funeral of 21-year-old Charles English, who was a Republican paramilitary who was killed in an explosion. One source that I came across mentioned an RPG rocket exploding in his hands. Galvin was pictured carrying the coffin alongside Martin McGuinness, and at the rear of the coffin were men wearing balaclavas. These images were significant and showed the world that Noraid was more aligned with the Provisional IRA than simply a charity. As you can imagine, Noraid faced mounting legal challenges back in the US. There was definitely a to and a fro. They claimed that they were a charity helping prisoners of war, whereas critics called them terrorist supporters. If $50,000 made its way across the sea and into the hands of the Provisionals, how could anyone know that 100% of that money was going towards supporting prisoners' families and not purchasing arms? There was also the fact that the IRA were definitely receiving support in America, either by money or by weapons importation, and it wasn't clear if Noraid were facilitating that in any way. I saw one source saying that there were pubs in Boston where you could bring a stolen gun in and the owner would purchase it off you, no questions asked. It would then be added to the stockpile and eventually sent to Ireland. Again, was this sympathetic Irish Americans, or was this in any way connected to Noraid? In 1971, the group had to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, claiming that they were a humanitarian group. In the US, under FARA, groups like Noraid were obliged to reveal their true patron, or principal, and disclose financial donations and their source. They claimed that they were agents of Belfast Northern Aid Committee, but the US Justice Department believed that they were acting as an agent of the Provisional IRA, and an FBI probe in 1972 seemed to come to the same conclusion. Yet Noraid wasn't closed down. Despite this, it would appear that American intelligence had informers embedded in Noraid and were tracking some of the leaders. Then, in 1977, two Noraid members based in Philadelphia, Daniel Callahan and Neil Byrne, were convicted of conspiracy to export arms. They were each sentenced to 1 year in prison. In 1981, a federal judge in the US ruled that Noraid was an agent of the IRA and ordered them to register the Provisional Irish Republican Army as its foreign principal. The judge ruled, quote, "The uncontroverted evidence is that Noraid is an agent of the IRA, providing money and services for other than relief purposes." Noraid fought against this, eventually reaching a compromise where they resumed FARA filings, but added a disclaimer stating that they were forced, under duress, to list the Provisional IRA as their foreign principal, allowing legal operation while publicly rejecting the IRA agent label. Perhaps the most well-known incident in Noraid occurred in 1982 when founder and president, 79-year-old Michael Flannery, was arrested. He and 4 others were charged with conspiracy to purchase 47 submachine guns from an undercover FBI agent. They were also attempting to purchase anti-helicopter missiles, silencers, a flamethrower, and armour-piercing ammo. Flannery's role appears to have been providing money for the guns, which may well have come through Noraid channels. This money was then given to George Harrison, who was a very well-known gunrunner for the IRA in the US, but not necessarily connected to Noraid. The case went to trial and lasted for 8 weeks. The defence adopted an incredibly unusual strategy. Instead of denying that they were trying to buy guns for the IRA, they admitted to the smuggling, but claimed that they did so under good faith and direction of the CIA. They claimed that the operation was sanctioned by the US government for anti-communism purposes, which was completely untrue, but would this claim be enough to sway a jury? The case became a bit of a circus. Each day, the court was full of supporters for the men, with Bernadette Devlin McCalliskey turning up to act as expert witness to provide the context of why this had occurred, as well as a Catholic priest. Michael Flannery was the only one testifying and gave long speeches to the jury on Irish history and British oppression. In one instance, a prosecutor stood up and announced that their intention was to prove that the men had been shipping arms to Ireland for the past 15 months. One of the accused, George Harrison, was upset by this claim and stood up and said to his attorney, "It's a lie. I've not been shipping arms to Ireland for the last 15 months. I've been shipping arms to Ireland for the last 15 years. Deliberations took 5 days. The judge was Irish American, as were some members of the jury, and in the end, all the men were acquitted. Outside the court, Michael Flannery pumped his fist and shouted, "Up the IRA." When asked by a reporter if his days of gun running were over after this case, George Harrison said that they would only be over, quote, "when the Brits are driven out." 4 months after this acquittal, Michael Flannery went on to become the Grand Marshal of the 1983 St. Patrick's Parade in New York, much to the annoyance of Irish media and politicians and many groups in the US. The Irish government backed out of supporting the parade that year. But overall, the court case and acquittal was seen as a significant PR coup for Noraid. That being said, the court case essentially dismantled the network of gun smuggling in the US, as George Harrison was the primary gun runner at the time. And afterwards, arms smuggling became infrequent and erratic. This case was a bit of a turning point, and provisionals began to look toward Europe and the Middle East for arms and support. In the wake of the Harrods bombing in London in 1983, which killed 6 people, UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher implored Noraid supporters in the US to take a firmer stance. Speaking in the wake of the bombing, Thatcher said, "Noraid might more appropriately be named Murder Aid or Terror Aid." Then a couple of years later in 1985, she tried a different approach, while addressing the US Congress. Quote, "Don't buy Irish deaths. Money is used to buy the deaths of Irishmen. 70% of those killed by the IRA are Irishmen." Thatcher wasn't the only critic of what Noraid was doing, though. Irish Foreign Minister Peter Barry was quite critical of them, saying, "Noraid succeeded in doing nothing except promote violence and open wounds." In Northern Ireland, former SDLP leader Gerry Fitt was also very critical, claiming that most, if not all of the money raised went to the purchase of guns. I've seen one source saying that there was a bit of a boomerang effect with Noraid. Whenever they were heavily criticised or whenever they were brought to court, this is when their funding increased the most. So in a way, the bad PR and bad press led to an increase in funding. Throughout the 1980s, Noraid continued to fundraise and send money back to Sinn Féin. As Sinn Féin got better organised back home, they saw potential in Noraid and wanted them to expand. This is a world in the wake of the hunger strikes, and Republicans believed that they could achieve a united Ireland by the Armalite and the ballot box. There were many US politicians who were sympathetic to the Irish cause, or who wanted to appeal to the Irish vote, and Sinn Féin wanted access to them. Sinn Féin sent over a representative to start working with Noraid and putting money into lobbying, which suited the likes of Martin Galvin. He was well known in the Irish American community and had close ties to Sinn Féin. But this new direction frustrated some in Noraid. I saw one quote from the then president at the time, Pat O'Connell, saying, "Americans are fed up with their own nation's politics. They sure as hell don't want to get involved in Irish politics. They only want to give money for the prisoners and their families, not for political lobbying." This would be the beginning of a split within Noraid, which would fracture its very core. In 1989, an open letter was penned and published in New York's 2 Irish weeklies that said Noraid was, quote, being steered in a direction towards politics and away from its original humanitarian objectives. The letter was signed by 41 people, but the first signature was somebody unexpected: Noraid founder Michael Flannery. As it turns out, 88-year-old Flannery was unhappy with the direction Noraid was taking and had quietly resigned from the party back in 1986. He did this behind the scenes because he didn't want it to affect donations to the organisation. I found one article saying that he resigned after Sinn Féin declared itself willing to take seats in the Irish Parliament, which he regards as the equivalent of the illegitimate Free State Parliament. Basically, he didn't want to support the burgeoning peace process, believing that Sinn Féin and the Provisionals were selling out. On a side note, Michael Flannery sounds like a very fascinating man. He still operated like the men he fought alongside in the 1920s, as a member of the anti-treaty army. He was an individual who took part in the seminal moments of Irish history, the War for Independence and the Civil War, and he lived to have a somewhat active role in the Troubles. He represents the classic Republican that many Irish people would consider heroes. But he worked alongside Troubles-era Provisionals, who would be considered much more controversial. His connection to the Troubles is almost like asking Michael Collins or Eamon de Valera what they thought of the Good Friday Agreement. Flannery ended up joining another group called Cumann na Saoirse before passing away in 1994. Then President of Noraid, Pat O'Connell, was then either fired or left of his own accord in 1989. He was seen as a, quote, hard-nosed dictator, blocking politics for pure fundraising. He went on to found Friends of Irish Freedom, but they weren't around for too long. As the 90s progressed and Sinn Féin started working toward peace, this had an effect on Noraid. Some people supported moving toward peace, but others were more fundamental, who saw peace as losing the fight for a united Ireland and conceding. Martin Galvin was perceived as a determined Republican, and it would appear that Sinn Féin wanted to sanitise themselves from this image. He was asked to step down a number of times and then eventually accepted and walked away. He did end up accusing Sinn Féin of selling out at the time, but in recent interviews he now speaks favourably of them. Friends of Sinn Féin was set up in the US in 1995, which further splintered Noraid. It was another fundraising organisation, but seen as a different one to Noraid and with none of Noraid's baggage. It opened up a whole new avenue of money to Sinn Féin and was extremely important when it came to political lobbying. By the mid-90s, Noraid had all but fizzled out. Friends of Sinn Féin had taken some of their members and were also generating a significant amount of money. They secured funding from wealthy Irish-American tycoons, construction unions, and those who saw Sinn Féin as the respectable peace vehicle. Then with the Good Friday Agreement, Noraid had no further need to agitate. Peace killed out the need to smuggle money and guns. It was also with Noraid where many in the US saw the famous England Get Out of Ireland banner, which was carried by members at the annual New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade, and it was the only political banner allowed in the parade. The banner has flown in the parade ever since, and there was controversy when the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou MacDonald, was pictured standing with the banner in 2019, and critics called it a sectarian banner. Noraid began as a response to the early Troubles violence, raising millions from Irish-American communities under the banner of humanitarian aid for prisoners' families. Many members were ordinary Irish-Americans. Supporters would say that Noraid stepped up at a time where the Irish government wasn't willing to support the people in Northern Ireland, and the funds they secured, especially in the early days of the Troubles, were badly needed. Nowadays, Noraid is all but gone, and the trickle of American funding has dried up, save for money passed down in wills. When asked if Noraid members are still meeting up, John McDonough had this to say: "At a freaking funeral home on Queen's Boulevard when they die. They're the only meetings you're going to get." I think we'll leave it there for now. Thanks, and see you next time. And also, folks, if you managed to stick around this long, I do want to talk a little bit about the Patreon page. I went back through the videos and I think I've uploaded over 100 videos on the Patreon. I do companion episodes after every episode, and I also do some unique to Patreon episodes. I did one on the original Bloody Sunday back in 1921, and I also have book clubs, movie recommendations. It's a really, really good place, and even, come over, jump onto a paid tier for like a month and then cancel it, and you'll get loads and loads and loads of more Troubles stuff. I've also done 3 music episodes now as well, so music from the Troubles. So if you like this podcast, you want to support it a little bit and help me continue it, please come on over to the Patreon and join one of the paid tiers. So thank you.